You know, I'm guessing you came across this video because something like this happened. Wow, Critical Role is super cool! Playing D&D looks awesome!
D&D? How does that work?
Well, there's a dungeon master who runs the game and all the NPCs, and then everyone else is a player, and they interact with NPCs and play through the campaign the dungeon master prepares.
That sounds like a lot of work for the dungeon master.
Yeah, it really is.
Well, that sounds cool. Who's going to be the dungeon master then?
I guess I can. And maybe from there you went online and found this and decided it'd be a good purchase. And well, I think you would be right. I think the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition starter set is great for new players and DMs. It does a really good job of giving you a solid preview of how a game of D&D can go. But if it's your first time ever looking through something like this, it can be kind of troubling to navigate. Maybe a little confusing. So in this video, I want to help you guys navigate this. So in this video, we're going to discuss the starter set rulebook, as well as the adventure, The Lost Mines of Phandelver. The adventure taking up most of the video. And just to be clear, this video won't be telling you the basics of how to play D&D, but rather, it's here to help you navigate the starter set, both the rulebook and the adventure, and some helpful tips for you as a new dungeon master. And why I think this starter set is really great for new dungeon masters. And one more thing, spoilers are incoming. So if you are a player who's currently playing in Lost Mines of Phandelver, or you ever plan on playing in this campaign, click away now, spoilers are coming. This is your one warning. But I promise you player videos are also coming. Every Thursday. Now with all that said, let's get into it. Starting off, when you open up the starter set, the first thing you'll find is a nice new pair of dice. It's a nice solid starter set, actually not too dissimilar from my first set of dice. You'll also find a few books inside, one of them being the starter set rulebook, which will have most of the rules you're going to need for this. We'll go over this one first. The other book that you'll find in the starter set is the adventure book, which is Lost Mines of Phandelver. It's the starter adventure, it takes characters from 1st to 5th level, but we'll go over this later. And last but not least, we have the pre-generated character sheets that the starter set comes with. Your players can use these as characters, and again, we'll go over these later. Now with all of that out of the way, let's dig into the rulebook. So kicking things off, we got the starter set rulebook. It's 32 pages long, and if you're running the game, I highly recommend going through this and reading it all the way through. Maybe even take some notes if you can. I think it contains most of, if not all, the rules necessary that you're going to want to know for running Lost Mines of Phandelver. So at the beginning of the starter set rule set, you'll see a section that is called How to Play. It tells you the foundational rules of the game, the 6 different dice that are used to play Dungeons & Dragons, as well as the 6 different ability scores, what they mean, when to use them. And beyond that, we have the rules on combat, and what they tell you is how combat flows in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Real quick tip about this section, you'll see a little header in here that says Instant Death. Spooky. So what this rule means is when your character takes damage from a single source, so one spell, one attack that takes them to 0 hit points, that remaining damage, if that equals the character's max level hit points or exceeds it, they die. So just as an example, let's say you have a wizard who has 2 current hit points and 7 maximum hit points. And then from a single attack from a goblin, let's say the goblin crits with their bow, and so they deal 2d6 plus 2 damage. The damage is rolled and you get 9. You say, alright, you take 9 points of damage. Wizard looks at their character sheet. They have 2 hit points, they go to 0. The remaining damage is 7, which is equivalent to the character's max level hit points. The wizard dies. I highly recommend ignoring this rules at least for the first few levels. What these combat rules fail to tell you is that combat is very swingy at early levels, especially level 1. One lucky, or in the player's case, unlucky roll can lead to their death before maybe they've even had a chance to roll a dice. This actually almost happened in one campaign I was in. The Dungeon Master on their very first attack roll rolled a natural 20 on a Wolf's Bite attack, did 17 points of damage to the monk, who had 9 maximum hit points. So they took the 9 damage, the leftover was 8, so they didn't instantly die, but if the Dungeon Master had rolled 1 more on that dice, the monk would have been dead before he even got to roll dice. That's my one tip for the combat section of the starter set rulebook. Definitely get yourself familiar with these rules, as you'll probably be using them a lot of it, in your first session of Lost Mines of Phandelver. After combat is adventuring, I don't have too many tips on this. What I would say is definitely get familiar with the equipment and the resting rules. Those will definitely come up in the first section. Those rules will help you answer questions like, what does my shield do? Or how do I get hit points back? Then we have Chapter 4, Spell Casting. Definitely the one that's overwhelming. There is a lot to this chapter. It can be very confusing. Just read the rules carefully, slowly, take notes, but don't worry, you don't need to memorize every spell in this book. No trouble in looking up a spell if you're not sure what it does. On the back cover of this book, you'll find the Appendix. And on the Appendix, you find all the conditions of 5th edition. I love this because it's super easy to reference during a game in case you forget what it means to be grappled or what it means to be restrained. So if it ever comes up in game, you just pick up your starter set rulebook, turn to the back, and boom, there you go. It's very easy to forget. There's a lot of rules of 5th edition. Just in my game recently, I had to go check to see the difference between grappled and restrained. No shame, and especially when it's that close to you and that easy to reference, why not? When you're new to the game and not quite familiar with all the rules yet, I think it's honestly okay to go and reference the rulebook, to go look up something real quick. Because if you don't know what it means to dash or something, it's going to be hard to make up or come up with what that actually means. So when you're new, just really quick, especially with the starter set rule, I mean, it's very quick. You got all the chapters up front, very easy to reference. Just open it up and flip to the page real quick. Maybe even take some notes on where you think special rules that you might want to know later on are. Now, after going through this entire starter set rulebook, you'll probably notice something that's missing. There's no rules to make a character in this book. Technically, you don't need them, assuming you have 5 or less players and they're all happy to play with the pre-generated character sheets provided. I generally recommend this. I think that playing with new players and just being a new dungeon master can be very confusing to make a character. You're not quite sure what is what. You can probably navigate it, but it might be a little confusing, maybe a little frustrating, especially when you have very little familiarity with the system. But I don't think it's impossible to make characters when you're new to the game, and if you have more than 5 players, or if your players don't want to use the pre-generated characters, you're going to want to make them. And that's where the SRD comes in. The SRD stands for Systems Reference Document. It is a free online document that Wizards of the Coast has put online, and it contains portions of the 3 core rulebooks of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. They are the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. 3 whole books, hence why the SRD is 400 pages long. But as some help, I'll throw a little reference on the screen to show which pages are important for character creation. Feel free to pause the video and take some notes for which pages are applicable to what you need, and I'll even throw a link to the SRD in the description below. Now, the SRD doesn't actually teach you how to make a character, it just contains the rules to do so. The Player's Handbook is actually what's responsible for teaching you how to make a character. So if you don't have the Player's Handbook, what I'd recommend is just Googling, going online, and typing in how to make a character in 5th edition. There's plenty of really great references online for this. Hopefully find some interesting stuff, because I think making characters in Dungeons & Dragons is a ton of fun. But that's the starter set rulebook. Take a look, take some notes, get familiar with it, especially before you run the game for the first time. But now, let's go over the bulk of the starting set, the adventure, The Lost Mine of Phandelver. What makes this adventure perfect for new players and dungeon masters alike is that it is your standard, stereotypical Dungeons & Dragons campaign. It isn't flashy, it isn't super special, it's not going to blow your socks off, but it is a good, solid, fun starting campaign. The center point of this adventure is Wave Echo Cave. It's a mine that's been lost to time but contains the Forge of Spells, a magical forge that can magically enchant weapons and armor. And it has recently been uncovered by the group's patron of this adventure, Gundren Rockseeker, who wants to put the forge back to use. However, the forge has also been discovered by an insidious figure known as Neznar, the Black Spider, and he's looking to claim the power of the forge for his own. Sounds like a good story in the making. So when you open the adventure booklet, you'll find that it begins with the introduction, and in the introduction you'll see the adventure overview, and it also gives some tips for running the game. I highly recommend reading the Rules to Game By sidebar of this section. It just really gives some useful tips and reminders for running the game. My favorite is the "It's a shared story" tip. Definitely let the player's actions determine the outcomes of this campaign. It'll get them sucked into the game, I promise you that. And of course, the other very helpful part of this chapter is the adventure hook. It's what gets every single adventure started, and it becomes the why as to why we are adventuring. I would say make sure to explain what this is during character creation, or at least prior to your campaign starting, so your players know what to expect. But you don't need to give any more specifics on the campaign otherwise. It's a pretty standard adventure hook. Gundren Rockseeker, the group's patron, hires a group of adventurers to escort a wagon of supplies to a frontier city known as Phandalin. You can, of course, come up with your own. That's kind of the fun of Dungeons & Dragons too, is coming up with your own story hook. But I think the books one works really well. Also in this section is the map of the local area, and it kind of highlights points of interest that you'll likely go to later on in this adventure. Definitely take a look, get familiar with it, and you'll definitely be referencing it later on, especially in Chapter 3. But at this point, I think we're finally ready to dig into the adventure's first chapter, Goblin Arrows. So for starters, definitely take a look at the bullet points at the start of this chapter and follow them. You definitely want to have your characters introduce themselves at the beginning of the adventure just so they get to know each other, and also gives them a chance to flex some role play muscles for maybe the first time. It'll probably be a little awkward at first, but that's okay. It'll ease them into maybe talking in person or maybe in third person if that's what they're comfortable with. Either way, it's helpful to get that as a start. So once introductions are complete, we begin heading off to Phandalin. We're escorting this wagon of supplies, but along the way, we're ambushed by 4 goblins. A very standard way to start a campaign, especially at level 1. I do have a tip here. I would recommend avoiding surprising your players here. I know the book recommends having them make stealth rolls and comparing that to perception checks or passive perception. But this first combat encounter, especially if your party is surprised and does not roll a very high initiative, can get bad pretty quick. So I'd recommend just having a standard initiative roll here. Just having everyone roll. Nobody's surprised. Everybody acts on the first round. This is because, as I said earlier, combat at level 1 is very swingy. It can go one way or another really quick. And if it's your first player's foray into Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition or tabletop RPG gaming, it would probably be good to go easy on them for their first combat. And besides, there's plenty more combat coming the rest of this chapter, so going easy on the first one does no harm. Assuming your party is winning the fight and defeating the goblins, I would definitely have one of the goblins begin to run away back to Kragma Hideout. I think a safe assumption here would be maybe he gets a little far, but the party will catch up and likely kill him. But this will lead them to the trail that leads them to Kragma Hideout. And I would just tell them, there's a trail here. It's clear that there's activity here. People are walking up and down this trail. Don't give them everything. Still allow them to make a survival check to learn information. For example, I would have them make the survival check to get the information that it appears 2 bodies were dragged recently down this path. I think with new players, it's okay to give a few things for free, some information. The reason I think it's helpful to give them a few things for free, especially if they're new to tabletop RPGs, is it can kind of get their head spinning and let them know, okay, this is an option I have. I can look for a trail to see if I can find anything here. They might just assume they see it, especially if they come from like a video game background. I promise you eventually your players will have this eureka moment where they realize, wait, we can do anything, and they begin to just start thinking out of the box and coming up with the craziest stuff. But again, don't be afraid to say there's a clear path here. I mean, there's enough goblins walking up and down this thing that I think that's reasonable. The same can be said about taking a goblin hostage. They may think, we just need to kill these guys. It's what I would do if I was playing a video game. The idea of taking a hostage may not have even crossed their mind. So just don't be afraid to ask them if they want to take one for hostage and question it. So assuming they eventually find the path, they begin heading up to Kragma Hideout. There, they'll find more combat with more goblins and even wolves, but there's definitely more here than just that. A good habit to get into is rather than just looking at that as just a series of a bunch of combat encounters, consider the politics of Kragma Hideout. For example, if you read through it, you'll see Ymik, who is the second in command goblin leader, really doesn't like the leader here in Kragma Hideout. He wants to get rid of Clark, so don't be afraid to have him try and broker a deal with the party, especially if things are going bad for the goblins, which they probably will. And this goes to all the unnamed goblins in the Kragma Hideout as well. Think about them. Have them think reasonably. One of the most fun things to do as a dungeon master is not think, what would I do? Think, what would this goblin do? What would Ymik do? What would Clark do if he was betrayed? Also, another cool thing about Kragma Hideout, don't be afraid to have the goblins use the flood. It sets a standard of using the environment to their advantage in combat. And your players will pick up on this and think in the future encounters, what about this environment can I use to my advantage? Maybe a player will notice a leaning tree in the future and want to kick it down onto an enemy. Who knows? The potential is limitless. That's Dungeons & Dragons. So your players will navigate this cave, fight some goblins, fight some wolves, maybe make a deal with Ymik and get betrayed and kill Clark, whatever it is. they come across and find Sildar. Sildar Hallwinter is where the story development comes in this chapter. The book provides some background details on him, so definitely read that to get familiar with him. So he wants to help Gundren secure the mine, but he's also looking for someone from his faction. It's a lost wizard that went missing shortly after they arrived in Phandelver. And you'll notice as you're reading through this part of the adventure that Sildar has a lot of information that you're going to want to pass on to the players. It'll probably feel like a bit of an information dump, but hopefully your players are asking him questions that you can use this information to weave into his answers. If they're not asking very many questions, don't have him just start blurting stuff out. You still have some time for Sildar to go with the party and make their way to Phandelver. Along the way, he can provide more information that'll feel more natural. Maybe even have him ask questions to the party, and that can provoke some conversation. Be a great time for him to ask, have you heard of Iarno? Do you know where he is? That can be an easy way of imparting some information to your party. It's especially important that they know that Gundren is somewhere in Kragma Castle, whatever that is. They don't know at this point, but they'll learn in Chapter 3. But from there, at that point, hopefully everybody's alive and accompanied by Sildar Hallwinter, and we're off to Chapter 2, Phandelver. Phandelver is your quintessential RPG town. It's got NPCs, it's got side quests, it's got a dungeon for your players to delve. It definitely does a good job of giving your players a lot of options, and definitely a chance to roleplay as well. But as a first-time dungeon master, this can be overwhelming because of just the sheer number of NPCs and side quests they have, and all the different locations. It can get a little crazy. I would recommend jotting some quick notes down so you don't feel like you need to memorize a chapter. It could be something as simple as location, NPCs here, and the quests they have. And probably even throw a page number next to it just so you know where to go in case you do need to reference it. But after the combat and the traveling, your party is probably ready for a rest. And naturally, when we want to rest, we're going to go to the inn. There they can of course find NPCs and side quests. But what is also important here is resting. Have them take a long rest. And at the end of their long rest, make them level 2. It's a great reward for being able to clear out Cragma Hideout. Honestly, I usually just ignore monster XP or quest completion XP, and I just use milestone leveling. Milestone leveling is just leveling up the party when it's appropriate for the story. So after a big milestone, they level up. So now as your party starts to make their way through Phandelver, talk to some NPCs, go to some different locations, take advantage of the rumors option. This is a great way to get your players to go from A to B to C to D to E, and to actually go through and see all of the town. And as they're walking through town, just don't be afraid to say like, oh hey, this building's here, you notice that. This building's here, you notice that. Let them know that there are points of interest. Think about it as their characters actually walking through Phandelver. Their characters would notice interesting buildings. It also just gives the players ideas of where to go and things to do. And as the book recommends, if your party is ever lost, definitely use the Red Brand Ruffians encounter. It's a great way to kickstart the chapter and actually will move them into the story development that occurs in Chapter 2. What also helps kickstart the story development of Chapter 2 is the quest Finding Iarno, which is, in my opinion, the most important quest for Chapter 2. This quest comes from Sildar Hallwinter, and he discovers that the man he's looking for, Iarno, recently went missing when he went to Tresendor Manor a couple months ago. This should be a clear giveaway to your party, hey, let's head that way. Assuming they do, this becomes your party's first dungeon crawl. And as the same as it was in Kragma Hideout, apply the same things here. Think about the NPCs in this Red Brand Hideout. How would they react? What would they do? The book already gives some points and tips here, but your party might do something unpredictable and you're going to have to think, what would this person do? Don't be afraid to roleplay as enemies during combat, in or out of it. Not necessarily everybody wants to fight to the death. And again, not everything needs to be combat. Maybe someone makes a deal. But combat is a lot of fun and a pillar of Dungeons & Dragons, so make sure that not everything is resolved through roleplay. Otherwise, it's a really fun dungeon crawl, I think, that's got a lot of depth to it. At the end of this dungeon, the story will continue to develop here as the party finds, captures, or kills Iarno. They discover he is the person responsible for starting the Red Brands. But there's also a lot of information that Iarno can pass on to the party, much like Sildar did. But he mainly has information on who the Black Spider is and what his ambitions are. If he is killed before he can tell the party the information, or you don't want another information dump, just throw whatever information he doesn't impart into his notes. You'll already see that there's some information contained within his notes and papers, no harm in adding some more. So, your party clears out Tresendor Manor and all the Red Brands, and they make their way back to Phandelver. Time for probably rest, and I think level 3. And as they hit level 3, we move on to Chapter 3, The Spider's Web. So this chapter has your party go out of Phandelver and go and start and complete whatever side quests they gathered. I recommend running this chapter generally as is. Feel free to fill in some gaps where you feel like is necessary. But I don't find too much wrong with it, and I think it's well suited to a new party, a new DM. Along the way, the book recommends some random encounters, which I would too, but what I like to do with random encounters is actually take the random out. What I like to do, and what I recommend you do, is you just pick out a few cool encounters that you enjoy, and then place them in the adventure where you feel is appropriate. I would recommend in between a few side quests, maybe from point A to point B I'll throw one, and then from B to C I'll throw the other one. What picking out these random encounters before you actually do them helps with is you get familiar with the monsters you're going to be running. This is just my own personal preference. Some people like the random aspect of D&D where they can just roll, look at a random encounter table, and go with it. And that's a lot of fun too. It is a game about letting dice decide your fate after all. But there is one thing I would change about this chapter. One thing specifically, and maybe if you've already flipped through the book at this point, you might have already figured out what that is. I'm talking about Thunder Tree, and in Thunder Tree, specifically Venom Fang. Venom Fang is a young green dragon who has recently taken the tower in Thunder Tree. In Thunder Tree, you will find the druid Rites, and he wants the party to get rid of Venom Fang. And if your party goes in guns blazing, they'll probably die. Now, to avoid that, there's a few things we can do. We can nerf Venom Fang's stat block by giving him less attacks, less health, less HP, which you can do. I don't really recommend. You could just remove Venom Fang entirely and place something else there, but I wouldn't recommend that either. I mean, you can remove it. It's on the cover. Here's what I would recommend with this encounter. I think it's your job as a dungeon master to foreshadow what will happen. They can talk to Rites, who should know how powerful a dragon like this is. And you could easily tell them they would require a very good plan to even stand a chance. But what I think is reasonable and probably more fun is to give your players a chance to fight this dragon. Give them some allies to help them. You'll discover later in this chapter there's a group of dragon cultists who came here to become allies with Venom Fang. But I would change them from dragon cultists to dragon hunters. They've tracked this dragon down. Maybe they've been tracking it for some time, and they want to kill Venom Fang. Another specific way you could do this, and one that I would probably go with, is that they're villagers from a nearby town that was just sacked by Venom Fang. And they want revenge because Venom Fang just destroyed their village. It adds depth, it adds motivation, and it adds a side story to this campaign. It gives them motivation to want to kill Venom Fang, if they even need it. I do think your players will want to attack and kill Venom Fang. I mean, who wouldn't? It's Dungeons & Dragons. So this is a really great opportunity to give your players a memorable encounter that'll make them want more and want to keep playing. Still, of course, foreshadow the danger of this encounter. Rites will know. I think the dragon hunters or the village members, whichever you decide to go with, will know. I mean, if it's the village members, they would have probably seen the dragon attack them, so they'll know it's got a poison breath. Should the encounter happen, make it difficult. Don't pull punches. And I think if you do it like this, it's not a good idea to have Venom Fang retreat at half hit points. You can either have Venom Fang fight to the death or retreat at a lower hit point threshold. If the fight is going really well in your party's favor, don't be afraid just to give Venom Fang a few hit points. You don't want the fight to be too short. That probably won't be very satisfying for your players. I think it's likely you have to give them more hit points considering your party just picked up a bunch of allies if it does end up going that way. If your party does end up doing that, they'll end up having a lot more attacks in their favor, which can quickly unbalance things. Even though they have a +3 and Venom Fang has an 18 AC, they're still going to be hitting about 1/4, 1/5 of the time. And that damage will add up, especially when there's like 6 or 8 of them. I think in an instance like that, don't be afraid to have Venom Fang just use her dragon breath on these guys. Average damage is plenty to kill these guys in one blow. Having Venom Fang take out like 4 or 5 of these guys in one breath weapon really shows how powerful he is. And of course, this applies here as well. Think about how Venom Fang would act. If it makes sense to run, then run. There's a lot you can do with this encounter, and I think it's one that your party should really try and do during this adventure. I think it's a fun highlight. Even though it doesn't really have anything to do with the main storyline, I think it's pretty cool. So whether you decide to maybe have them get the extra allies, maybe you just have them stay as cultists and side with the dragon in the final fight just to see how it goes. I think you'll find when your party is stacked up against insurmountable odds, that's when they become very clever and come up with just the craziest plans. So maybe just leave it as is and see what your party does. But just be warned, it can get deadly. And of course, the other major part of this chapter is Kragma Castle. Again, another fun dungeon crawl. I personally like running this one as is, but make changes where you think is necessary. There are a lot of cool monsters here like Gricks and owlbears and even a doppelganger, so read up. And of course, the story development of this chapter, at least for the main quest line, is the party finds Gundren Rockseeker here in Kragma Castle. The story development specifically coming from his map. It's discovering where Wave Echo Cave is. And if they don't find it, there are other ways to get the location of Wave Echo Cave, like from Ridoth. He'll pass that along if they scare away Venomfang. Regardless of what happens during this chapter, at the end of it, make sure the party's level 4. So hopefully with Gundren in hand, and hopefully the map and location of Wave Echo Cave, the party can make their way back to Phandelver, get some rest. But that will bring us to this book's exciting closure, Chapter 4, Wave Echo Cave. So once rested and resupplied, the party can make their way to Wave Echo Cave, and thus the conclusion of this adventure and the final dungeon crawl. I think for starters, looking through this chapter, you'll discover there is a lot of combat. 10 sturges, 9 skeletons, 3 ghouls, 5 bugbears, 8 zombies. The list goes on. I think you can leave these combats as they are in the book, but what is important is you make sure that they are a part of the story. These combat encounters tell us what Wave Echo Cave would tell us if it could talk. That is, in my opinion, what combat is best used for in a dungeon. They tell you about what happened here in the past. They tell you about the dungeon as it is now. Make it clear that these undead have been here for so long and that they were probably members of the final combat of Wave Echo Cave. If you leave the combat encounters as they are without having them add to the story of the dungeon, it can lead to a slog. It just becomes rolling, asking if you hit, whether you hit, you miss, you roll some damage, things will die. Okay. Which is fine, and I like combat, but there's definitely missed opportunity if you don't use it to tell them about Wave Echo Cave. So further the story and enhance how cool this cave is by having these combat further the story. Just keep in mind the roleplay doesn't stop when initiative starts. And that definitely includes a dungeon master. Otherwise, I like this dungeon as it is, and again, I think like most things in this campaign, it is made for new dungeon masters, it's made for new players, it's pretty simple, it's still cool, but it's pretty simple. One thing I would consider to liven up in this dungeon as well is Neznar, the Black Spider, the enemy and final boss of this campaign. Liven up his curiosity and his evil in this final encounter. Do your best to have him convince the players that he'll offer his full cooperation and surrender and getting the Forge of Spells, but have him turn on them in the last moment. And when things go bad for him, he runs. He's evil. He doesn't want to die. And hopefully they win in their final encounter and they defeat Neznar the Black Spider. And thus they recapture Wave Echo Cave and thus the Forge of Spells. And that's it for the campaign. I definitely think you should consider the conclusion part of this chapter. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, there is nothing better than having your players' actions have long-lasting impacts. So reading through that, you could see, yeah, why can't my players restore Tresendor Manor and claim it as their own? That sounds really cool and really fun. Let them know that's an option. So if you and your players decide to keep playing with these characters in this campaign, they have a home base. And if you guys decide to stop playing, but you want to keep playing in the Forgotten Realms, well, the next campaign, if you ever come to Phandelver, they can see the effects of their characters' actions from the previous campaign in the new one. Phandelver is no longer a frontier city being raided by bandits. It's a thriving city now. It's prosperous. The mine's open. The Forge of Spells is there and working. For me, that is also what makes D&D so special. When your actions matter, they tell a story and they leave a long-lasting impact on the area. And even better yet, when you can go and visit that in future campaigns. And with that is all I have to say on the starter set adventure, The Lost Mines of Phandelver. It's definitely not a world beater, per se, but I think what it sets out to do, it succeeds in. It is a great starter adventure for new players and new DMs. And I promise you, it'll leave you, the Dungeon Master, and your players itching for more. Thanks for watching. I hope you really enjoyed the video. And if you are itching for more, I think I'll have a couple videos out of this upcoming week. I do one every Tuesday and every Thursday. Tuesday's videos are normally going to be just a random discussion on something about D&D. Every Thursday, we're going to be doing something called the subclass series. I think that's what I'm going to call it. I'm not sure yet. We'll be going over every single subclass in the game. We'll just go over the mechanics, but especially kind of the role play and potential characters you can make with it. It'll be a lot of fun, so hopefully you're there. But with that, we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.